Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're diving straight into a truly fascinating textual history. We're going to trace how one ancient story, the story of the people of Lut, literally mutated over centuries. We'll look at how different editorial choices made across religious traditions ended up shaping not just scripture, but our actual modern legal reality. It's really a story about what traditions choose to emphasize, what they quietly toss aside, and ultimately, who actually ends up paying the price for those choices.
So to really ground this, let's look at the world right now. Take a look at this modern poster. You can see how this ancient theological discussion of Lut instantly roots itself in the very severe legal codes and social stigmas we have today. It's using scripture, specifically Quran 66:10, to draw a hard modern line on LGBTQ rights. We are literally seeing texts written millennia ago being deployed right now, today, to build cultural and legal boundaries. And it really makes you wonder, right? How exactly did we get from this ancient narrative all the way to this incredibly strict modern reality?
Well, the consequences of this text are deeply, deeply personal, and they're embedded in everyday language. From the streets of Cairo to Karachi, the name of a literal prophet has been transformed into a slur. Think about it. In the Muslim world, parents are always looking for beautiful Islamic names from the Quran for their kids. You'll meet a million Yusufs, Abrahams, and Yaqubs, but you will practically never meet a Lut. The term Ludi has been totally worn down into a derogatory insult aimed at queer people. So right off the bat, this establishes the very real, immediate human stakes of the textual history we're looking at. Let's pull up our timeline and see how this narrative actually builds. It's honestly like playing a massive generational game of telephone across the three major Abrahamic faiths. The story doesn't just pop up out of nowhere in the Quran or Islamic jurisprudence. It actually starts way back in Genesis. And as it gets passed down, from the Torah to the Talmud, through the New Testament, into the Quran, and finally landing in Islamic fiqh, you start to notice something. Specific details are heavily emphasized, while others are just completely discarded. Tracking these editorial choices actually tells us way more about the evolving traditions themselves than it does about the sin they claim to be condemning. Now, what is absolutely fascinating here is the stark contrast between how the earliest readers understood this story and how later traditions interpreted it. The original Jewish readings, they focused heavily on a society that was destroyed for institutionalized cruelty. The whole point was about the systemic abuse of the vulnerable. But then, when we look at the Islamic interpretation later on, that broad societal critique is, well, it's pretty much gone. Instead, the focus narrows down almost entirely to same-sex desire. So let's unpack exactly what that original Jewish tradition was actually focusing on. In its origins within Judaism, this was a story about what happens when a society makes cruelty its official policy. Ezekiel 16:49 explicitly names the sin of Sodom as arrogance, excess, and a total neglect of the poor. The Talmud, specifically Sanhedrin 109a, describes a city with institutionalized malice. We're talking about a place where giving to charity was actually a punishable offense, and travelers were literally tortured just to fit into a standard-sized bed. And while the text does leave a little room for a sexual reading, homosexuality was just a minor, vaguely mentioned footnote compared to the sheer, terrifying scale of their inhumanity towards strangers. But then, as Christianity inherited the text, the lens shifts pretty dramatically. The New Testament, particularly Jude 1:7, basically starts to drop that whole inhospitality context, and the narrative narrows purely to sexual immorality, specifically what they called going after strange flesh. And what's wild here is that the New Testament actually prescribed absolutely zero legal penalty for this. None. But this narrowing of the narrative laid the groundwork for medieval lawyers, centuries later, to just invent the legal and civil crime of sodomy. So the pattern was set, right? Inherit the text, pick what to emphasize, and let the legal system outpace the scripture itself. Fast forward to Islam absorbing the story. Here, Lut gets elevated from a flawed man to a completely sinless prophet. And the Quran centers his condemnation of his people on just one single word, fahisha. Now, this is a broad Arabic term meaning indecency or obscenity. But it's absolutely crucial to note that fahisha is not a homosexuality-specific word. Not at all. It actually pops up in at least 24 different contexts across the Quran. So it took some serious interpretive gymnastics by much later jurists to fuse this incredibly broad term specifically and categorically with same-sex behavior. Now, as these traditions grappled with the narrative, they inevitably had to confront some deeply, deeply uncomfortable moments in the text. And this brings us to a profound ethical dilemma sitting right there in the source material. In Genesis, and repeated again in the Quran, Lut is facing a sexually violent mob that is demanding access to his male guests. And his response? He literally offers his daughters to the mob instead. It raises a question these traditions almost never ask. Who asked the women? I mean, it's a staggering moment. You have a prophet offering up female bodies to a violent mob as a crowd control strategy just to protect his male guests.
This brilliantly illustrates how these different faiths made completely different editorial choices just to protect their own specific theology. Judaism retained both the offer to the mob and a much later story where Lot's daughters commit incest with him in a cave. And they treat it with a bit of sympathy because to them, Lot wasn't considered a flawless, perfect prophet. Christianity, they largely just ignored the daughters entirely. But Islam had a very strict theological motivation. They needed Lot to be an innocent, sinless prophet. So Islamic tradition retained the offer to the mob, often sanitizing it in classical commentary as like a legitimate marriage proposal to the town's women, but they completely dropped that whole subsequent cave incest part to preserve his purity.
So let's look really closely at exactly how the Quran frames this act. In Quran 780, Lut asks his people, "Do you commit fahasha that no one among the worlds has preceded you in?" The tradition leans heavily on this verse to frame same-sex behavior as an entirely unprecedented sin, like something completely invented from scratch by the people of Sodom. But because this is being presented as a factual historical claim, well, we can actually test that against the historical and scientific record.
And here is where we juxtapose that theological claim against actual physical history. Take a look at the Egyptian tomb of Khnum-Hotep and Nwankh-Khnum. This was built around 2400 BCE, which is centuries before the traditional timeline for Lut, yet we see two men buried together in intimate poses usually reserved for married couples. We see these same practices continuously documented in ancient Indian sculpture across Greece, Rome, and China. I mean, it's even in the 3rd century Kama Sutra. This was happening centuries to millennia before the Quranic revelations. So the historical record makes it pretty clear. This behavior was far from unprecedented.
And the really crucial point here is that biology also completely contradicts this claim of an unprecedented sin that supposedly violates the natural order. Researchers have observed and documented same-sex behavior in over 1,500 different animal species. We're talking everything from primates down to gutworms. In fact, a 2024 meta-analysis found that 77% of researchers have observed same-sex interactions among animals. Nature has literally been practicing this for millions of years. The people of Sodom, they definitely didn't invent it.
Okay, let's shift to how the penal code was actually constructed, because this is where the gap between scripture and law gets massive. Listen to this. The Quran prescribes absolutely zero worldly punishment for homosexual acts. None. Zero. The capital offense of liwat was built much, much later by classical Islamic jurists. And how did they do it? They relied on a tiny handful of contested hadiths, like those in Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi, and they used analogical reasoning to basically force the laws of zina, or fornication, onto same-sex acts. While the Hanafi school treated it as a discretionary punishment, other major schools took that leap and demanded death by stoning.
So what about women in all of this? Well, surprisingly, the Quran never addresses lesbian women at all. The entire legal architecture of the tradition was completely built around male bodies, male access, and male authority. Because women's sexuality was largely assumed to just be contained by men, lesbians felt entirely outside the Quran's frame of reference. They just weren't anticipated. Yet, despite being totally absent from the text, classical fiqh somehow still found ways to consider them sinful and punish them regardless. Finally, we have to look at the physical evidence of the story itself. The Quran vividly describes the destruction of Sodom, right? Baked clay stones called sijil raining down from the sky, and the whole city being physically inverted, just turned completely upside down. It's a dramatic image. Yet, archaeologists have found zero physical evidence of this happening. We found ancient Troy, we found Bronze Age destruction layers all across the Levant, but we have found absolutely no site matching the specific, catastrophic physical signature described in these texts. Sodom remains completely archaeologically unverified. And this total lack of physical evidence sets up a really haunting contrast to the very real, very heavy legal systems it left behind. Which brings us to our final thought for today. The physical evidence of Sodom's destruction is completely absent. Yet the real-life casualties of the editorial choices made around this story, they are present everywhere. From individuals forced to live their entire lives in hiding to devastating capital punishments that are still being enforced globally today. We've literally found no physical trace of Sodom in the earth, so we are really left to ask, how much longer will millions of people be forced to pay the devastating human cost for an evolving ancient story?